And I'll begin with a brief introduction for Professor Kalmer. He's a Professor of Anthropology and the Honorable Newton W. Rowell Professor at Victoria College at the University of Toronto. His work is focused on the image of the Jew in Western Christian cultural history and how it is related to the image of the Muslim. Professor Kalmer has written a large number of articles on the subject. Professor Kalmer wrote the books The Trotskys, The Freuds, and The Woody Allens, and Early Orientalism, Imagined Islam and the Notion of Sublime Power. He co-edited the book Orientalism and the Jews. His latest research is about Islamophobia in the previously communist areas of the European Union. Professor Kalmer.
Thank you very much, for the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor and a pleasure to have been invited to address this admirable group. Can everybody hear me? It's a pleasure to address this admirable group. When Samira suggested it to me, I accepted immediately. Politically and morally, and not only intellectually, addressing Islamophobia and anti-Semitism is one of the things I think we must do together, given what's happening in the world today. I hope you forgive me for beginning on a personal note. I was born in Prague and grew up in Bratislava, capitals today of two independent countries. These cities have changed allegiance frequently. A senior citizen who never moved from one of them might have lived in 3 or 4 countries, so often did borders get redrawn here. National identities have changed too. The same person may have been born as a German or Hungarian and ended up as a Czech or a Slovak. On the other hand, if one was a Jew like I am, then one remained a Jew. That's the way others, and that's the way I would see it. For being Jewish was to everyone not a matter of religion as much as a matter of descent. And just like everyone believed this to be true, so everyone believed that the Jews' origins were outside the country and outside Europe in their exotic biblical homeland in the Orient. Asiatic refugees, the 18th century German political philosopher Christian Wilhelm von Dohm called the Jews. After the devastation of the Holocaust, which did not spare members of my parents' family either, there were far fewer Jews in the former Czechoslovakia, and they were even more culturally assimilated to the rest of the population than the Jews before the war. As one of these, I was intensely interested in my Jewish origins, which were still a mystery to me as a teenager, when I discovered the building of the former Reform synagogue in Bratislava. On one of my walks to the city's Castle Hill, I looked down at the building's glistening oriental domes and its exotic horseshoe window. Unfortunately, it's hard to find a good picture of that synagogue, which was demolished in the meantime. But you'll get some idea if you look at the interior of the Jerusalem Street Synagogue in Prague, which is still standing. When I looked down at Bratislava's cityscape from its castle, the synagogue was still there, but it had long ceased to be used as such. It was a television studio with no sign explaining its past or its unusual architecture. I felt unrecognized, out of place, and out of time like all teenagers. But here I found a material manifestation of all that, articulated through my Jewish background. For the first time, perhaps, being Jewish took hold of me as a powerfully enigmatic feeling, a feeling that even Freud, the master of the unconscious, admitted that he was unable to understand. For me, the mystery of the synagogue building was a Semitic one. I saw myself as Dom would have, a stray creature from the Orient. Synagogues that use features of Islamic architecture are found throughout the Western world. Even today, the two tallest minarets in America are those of the Plum Street Temple in Cincinnati, built in 1862. The magnificent Synagogue of Liverpool, sorry, this one is not the magnificent Synagogue of Liverpool, but the Central Synagogue, one of several in New York who are built in this style. Let's see what's the next one. This is the magnificent Synagogue of Liverpool, which shows the influence of South Asian Islamic architecture. In Florence, there is the Tempio Israelitico. The Doheim Street Synagogue of Budapest is perhaps the best known European example. Again, that's not it. This is it. Having been built by one of the first architects interested in the Orientalist style for synagogues, the Viennese architect Ludwig von Förster. In Toronto, there were a number of these Orientalist synagogues, including the earlier Holy Blossom Temple on Bond Street, constructed in 1897. I wonder if I could ask someone to reverse the slides, because the clicker won't do that, although, yeah. Just to, if it's not too much trouble, if we could go 2 slides back. Yeah, so this is the Holy Blossom, the original Holy Blossom synagogue in Toronto. And it's a sign that Jews were no longer imagined so much as an Eastern race, that when the new temple, Holy Blossom Temple, why are they not members of this interfaith group? When they built the later building in the 30s, it was no longer in this style. So this, we're talking about the late 19th and early 20th century. You can just see that when they moved, it became a Greek Orthodox church. They got rid of the domes on top. They replaced them with a somewhat different style, did some cosmetics, so that it now looks like a Byzantine building. It's become common to call the Islam-inspired style of synagogue Moorish style because of a mistaken impression that their purpose was to celebrate the achievement of the Jews who lived relatively freely and created a prosperous and cultured community in Moorish-ruled medieval Spain. But while Moorish was indeed one of the labels used in some places for this kind of a synagogue, even in the 20th century, at first a more common description was Arabic or Arabian style. Certainly Förster described his goal for the Budapest synagogue as, quote, choosing the architectural forms that have served the Oriental ethnic group related to the Israelite people, and especially the Arabs, unquote. Arabs were known as a Semitic people, and so were the Jews. Hence, everyone in the West saw the Jews as the relatives of Arabs. And although, of course, most Muslims are not Arabs, the Prophet Muhammad and his followers were. And in the Western mind, the Arab people were inseparable from Islam, and vice versa. To philosophers of religion like Hegel, Jews invented Judaism and Arabs invented Islam, and both religions showed their Oriental racial imprint. The image of the Oriental-style synagogue stayed with me from my teenage years, and in the 90s I began to write about how in the West Jews had been imagined as related to Muslims. This is a fact that hits anyone who studies the historical record. Edward Said, in his famous 1978 book, Orientalism, recognized this imagined kinship when he wrote that in writing the history of what we might now call Islamophobia, he found himself, quote, writing the history of a strange secret sharer of Western anti-Semitism, unquote. Yet that statement was forgotten for a long time. Nor did I have much luck. Comparisons between Western attitudes to Jews and Muslims, or more specifically to anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, found little sympathy. Jews didn't like it, and Muslims didn't like it, for reasons I'll come back to later. As late as 2015, I was unable to get a research grant on the topic of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and that was the third time I tried. I changed my grant proposal to just Islamophobia, with anti-Semitism presented as a kind of footnote, and presto, they gave me a 5-year grant. It could very well be, though, that I would get that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia grant now. Something has changed bigly during the last 2 years. The joint image of Jew and Muslim, so common in earlier history, had resulted in a separation of the two, which is why by Said's time the relationship became a secret. But now it's been resurrected. In discussions of Islamophobia, references to anti-Semitism as a precedent have become almost obligatory. To cite one randomly chosen example, a young blogger called Charles B. Anthony writes under a picture of Donald Trump, who appears to be giving a Nazi salute, quote, "I make no bones in saying this. Muslims are the new Jews. Perpetually vilified in the press, scapegoated by politicians and attacked in ever-increasing numbers on the street, Muslims are punished for their faith and culture, shackled to the jailer of prejudice, drunk on his own self-righteous thirst for supremacy," unquote. The comparison that is made between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism generally draws parallels between the Muslims of our own time and the Jews of the period that led up to the Holocaust, especially in Germany. An ad for a documentary about Hannah Arendt states, quote, "There's a refugee crisis in Europe and people around the world are wondering how it came to pass that a totalitarian regime gained power in a democratic system. Sound familiar? That was the world that the stubbornly unclassifiable and brilliantly disruptive German Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote about after living through World War II," unquote. The fact is, though, that the historical evidence for imagining Jews and Muslims in similar ways reaches much farther back than the Nazis or even their immediate predecessors, in whose time the Orientalist synagogues that I showed you were built. Attitudes towards Muslims and Jews have been intertwined in the Christian West, not just since the 1930s, but since the very beginning of Islam in the 7th century. Muslims were seen in a large number of medieval and later texts as people who knew true, that is, Western Christianity, but rejected it for the outdated and superseded law of Moses in stubborn refusal of the true message of Christ. Thus, although Islam came after Christianity, it could be seen as not a genuine innovation, but a throwback to the pre-Christian monotheism that is to Judaism. Much of the disputes, criticism, and venom directed at Judaism could therefore also be thrown at Islam. The Jew, in short, provided a pattern for imagining the Muslim. This was the case until well into the 19th and even the 20th century. As the foundations of modern democracy were laid in the 17th and 18th century, the political issue of the period was the nature of autocracy. The Muslim empires of the Ottoman Turks and the Persians were identified with Oriental despotism. The notion of the Oriental despot was assimilated not only to the Muslim Allah, but also to the alleged pre-Christian notion of God, the equally despotic Jewish Jehovah. The Pauline opposition between obedience to the letter versus the spirit of the law came to be reaffirmed as one between slavish allegiance to a despotic external authority and consent stemming from the internalization of divine grace. The eventual adjoining of Jew and Muslim, the latter with obvious imprecision in the form of the Arab, as members of one race, to be called Semitic, was crucially related to the notion of the Aryan race and to pan-Germanic, pan-Italian, and pan-Slavic sentiments. The Germanic Romance and Slavic language families were Aryan, linked in the unfathomable depths of time to the languages of Iran and northern India. The Semitic family that included Hebrew and Arabic was understood to be an outsider to this history. The mistaken yet common confusion of linguistic relationships with racial descent and the assumption that each race inherited a different character and spiritual proclivities added up to the conclusion that the Jews were culturally alien to the West and more akin to their Arab racial quote-unquote cousins. In the popular intellectual history of the time, thus were joined the inventors of Judaism and the inventors of Islam. And yet, until its very recent revival, this joint image disappeared, as I mentioned, and Jews and Muslims came to be seen as opposite rather than similar to each other. And let's face it, while we mostly educated folks are gathering here at a multi-faith meeting in each other's support, we can't get away from the fact that still today some of the worst anti-Semites are Muslims, and some of the worst Islamophobes are Jews. Several of my friends and relatives have encountered Muslim taxi drivers whose angrily voiced opinions about Jews would make a Nazi blush. But I also hear Jewish friends and relatives talk about Muslim proclivities for terrorism, sexism, and homophobia that leave me speechless. Though the role of Muslims in anti-Jewish violence is often exaggerated, there is very little doubt that a lot of it in Europe and in North America is perpetrated by Muslims. At the same time, a leading role in generating and spreading Islamophobia is played by some Jews, both as writers and as donors. It is easy to see the reason why the once overwhelming link between Jews and Muslims would have eventually become an oblivious secret. The cause is the elephant in the room in any meeting about Muslim-Jewish cooperation: Israel-Palestine. The bloody contest over historic Palestine has for over 100 years seen a concerted resistance by most Arabs to Jewish immigration and to the establishment of the Jewish state, Arabs and Muslims only very rarely bought into the rhetoric of a racial kinship amongst the Semites of the Occident and the Semites of the Orient. The many Jews who did buy into it eventually gave up in the face of the reality on the ground. The erasure served the relative political strategies of both Israelis and Palestinians and their supporters, including Jews mostly on one side and Muslims mostly on the other. The conflict has invaded every aspect of the struggle that has broken out in recent years about the expression new anti-Semitism. Is Islamophobia the new anti-Semitism, as those defending Muslims like to say? Or is it rather that, quote, anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism, unquote, as many supporters of Israel insist? The battle is superficially about definitions. When I talk about Islamophobia, I'm inevitably asked for a definition. I know that in most cases the questioner is not really looking for a definition as such, though, but rather wants to press me on the issue of so-called legitimate criticism of Islam. What can you say against Islam, they are thinking and sometimes saying, that is based in fact and not in prejudice, and therefore is not Islamophobic? Likewise, there's an obsession with definitions when it comes to anti-Zionism. What constitutes legitimate criticism of Israel? And what is really anti-Semitic prejudice? Some Jews feel that the very statement that, quote, Islamophobia is the new anti-Semitism is anti-Semitic. Among other things, they object to what they see as a suggestion that there could be a Muslim Holocaust. Islamophobia is the new anti-Semitism effectively takes away the moral claim of Jews of being the most victimized people in history. Of course, that moral claim is, among other things, a much-used weapon in the arsenal of those who support Israeli policies. In this context, it's understandable that Islamophobia is the new anti-Semitism finds little objection among most Muslims. There are exceptions, however, like one blogger who writes about the ominous similarities between anti-Semitic persecution in the 30s and today's discrimination against Muslims. She approves, but for an unstated reason adds, quote, "But I wouldn't go as far as to say that Muslims today are the new Jews," unquote. Why not? Presumably because a comparison to much talked about anti-Semitism may cheapen the current suffering of the Muslim communities and deflect from specific discussion of it. And who knows, perhaps she's thinking that it might add support for the Zionists. So there's clearly a kind of perverse competition of victims at play here. But, as the Swiss Muslim author and Oxford professor Tariq Ramadan warns, it's imperative to stop the politics of victimhood. Comparing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia should certainly not suggest complete equivalence between the two forms of hatred, and so be used to devalue the significance of the Holocaust. But what it can buy us is the ability to recognize our own suffering in the suffering of others, and to unite against all injustice. If more people had recognized the need to fight anti-Semitism in the 30s, it would have helped to save freedom, democracy, and human decency for everyone, not only the Jews. Indeed, fighting Islamophobia is today also a means of fighting anti-Semitism. Recent events have begun to provide evidence that Islamophobia revitalizes anti-Semitism. Not long ago, Hungary was proverbial for its far right, mixing anti-Semitism with Islamophobia. Even in a country like the Czech Republic, which in spite of its Eastern European location shows low rates of anti-Semitism, but where anti-Muslim sentiments are high, the researcher Zbigniew Tarant has discovered that anti-Jewish literature was being handed out at anti-Islam rallies. In America, although Donald Trump presents himself as a friend of the Jews, Jewish public personalities have complained of receiving hate messages from Trump supporters. The journalist Bethany Mandel felt she needed to buy a gun after receiving some very nasty threats for her tweets about Trump and his anti-Semitic supporters. The spate of attacks on Jewish cemeteries in the United States a few months ago is widely attributed to the encouragement that Trump's Islamophobia gives to anti-Semites. Clearly aware of this, in one well-publicized case, American Muslims pulled their resources together to help clean up the St. Louis area cemetery that was vandalized. If Israel-Palestine was the political reason for Jews and Muslims to pull apart and often become enemies, the potential for pulling together has a political reason too, the shift in so many countries to the populist extreme right. The election of Donald Trump is the most striking example, of course. But going east to west, there are Duterte in the Philippines, Xi Jinping in China, Putin in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey, Orban in Hungary already in power, and Wilders in Holland and Le Pen in France, thankfully repelled for now, but still waiting in the wings. These are champions of what Hungary's Orban proudly calls illiberal democracy. Obscurantist nationalists who suspect immigrants, parliamentarians, bankers, artists, academics, LGBT people, feminists, and environmentalists. They equate race and nation with nature and feel that it's common sense for an ethnically divided nation, for an ethnically defined nation to exclude outsiders. We know that, as Marine Le Pen, for example, does not cease to say, globalization is their greatest enemy. They count among their ranks those who have been damaged by the advances of globalized capitalism, the unemployed and the precariously employed, the residents of dwindling rural communities, the aging who can't fathom a greatly changed world. Declared obsolete by the elites of self-declared world-class cities, these groups swing to the populist right is their half-baked, fully misguided revenge. It is of necessity in search of an outsider scapegoat. In Europe and North America, that outsider is the Muslim. Blaming Muslims seems right to the gullible, who witness that millions of Muslims have come to live among Europeans and North Americans, and have no intention even if they could, to stop being Muslims any more than the Jews as a whole were ever prepared to become anything but Jews. This takes us full circle to the beginning of my talk and the declarations of how Islamophobia, the new anti-Semitism, is similar to the hatred of Jews. It is abundantly clear that wherever Islamophobia rears its ugly head, anti-Semitism follows. Wherever illiberal democracy's false anti-globalism appears, demagogues look for ready scapegoats. And in the West, the oldest ready-made scapegoats are the Muslim and the Jew. The ultimate enemy right now is therefore illiberal democracy, that is to say, extreme right populism. The title of my talk today speaks of common challenges. Extreme right populism is the greatest one. It is a sad illusion for anyone to think that in the West, extreme right populism can be allowed to be just Islamophobic or just anti-Semitic. It always becomes both. Unfortunately, extreme right populism is gaining ground in Israel as well. Some uncritical supporters of Israel evidently feel that supporting Islamophobic nationalists in Europe or America will serve Israeli interests by damaging Israel's mostly Muslim enemies. Well, it's true that some nationalist populist anti-Semites can be friendly to Israel. Some see even Trump and certainly Bannon or Le Pen and Wilders in this light. But this should be no more surprising than the fact that Trump, as Islamophobic a leader as any, is buddy-buddy with Erdogan and with Saudi Arabia. For we know very well how often an anti-Semite's best friends are Jewish. Where there are common interests, they may overrule racist rhetoric. None of this overrides the clear evidence that Islamophobia leads to revived anti-Semitism. It may be possible for the Israeli nationalist populists to strengthen their political clout by Islamophobia, but supporting Islamophobia is against the self-interest of Western Jews. No wonder there's hardly a day that the major Israeli liberal paper, Haaretz, does not report some new evidence of a growing cleavage between, for example, American Jews and the Israeli political establishment. Increasing numbers of Jews in the West realize that making common cause with Muslims in the West is in their interest. They're opening up to cooperation with Muslims in fighting the common enemy, right extremist populism. The interest that Muslims have in fighting that enemy is, of course, clear, as in recent years, Islam and Muslims have become the right extremists' prime scapegoat. Recognizing that right extremism is the common enemy has turned many Muslims towards greater interest in working together with Jews, who may have previously appeared mainly as the enemy around the Israel-Palestine question. This is what I mean by common challenges and a common response. Most major cities in the Western world have seen joint action by religious and grassroots institutions and individuals to express solidarity and to defend human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, which is the common heritage of Muslim and Jewish citizens, as well as Christians and everyone else. Toronto is no exception, and common action has increased since the terrible killings at Quebec City. At least as important, I see a change in the hearts of many Jews I know towards a recognition that protecting the rights and dignity of our Muslim neighbors protects the rights and dignity of us all. Tariq Ramadan, whom I have already mentioned, says that intercultural dialogue is not enough. There's a danger that it will entrench differences. Dialogue, he suggests, should be supplemented by common action, by finding causes that in spite of our differences, we can make our own. It's not easy, but we may keep our differences as long as we're reasonable about Israel and Palestine. We can come together as we have here tonight, Muslims, Jews, and Christians, to build solidarity at a time of common challenge, the challenge of misguided populism. And apart from protecting all of us, working together is an opportunity to further what must be the greatest moral goal at this point in time, the goal of mutual recognition. Thank you.